You need to be able to hydrate yourself. And so the Canyon Lux has 2 water bottle mounts. Is that what they're called? Water. Hey everyone, my name is Sarah Moore and we're here in Squamish, BC, where I've gone back to my cross-country racing roots to chase Mike Levy up some heinous climbs for the cross-country field test. With me here is a team replica edition of the Canyon Lux, a very similar bike to the one that Mathieu van der Poel was supposed to be racing at the Tokyo Olympics this year. With 29-inch wheels, 100mm front and rear, the Canyon Lux was designed with cross-country racing in mind. This bike actually came out in June of 2018, which by our standards usually makes it old news. But because it has some World Cup and World Championship winning pedigree, and we hadn't spent very much time on it, we decided it would be a good baseline to include in this field test, and we were also curious about how much geometry has changed. Let's get into the frame details. Unsurprisingly, like most cross-country bikes out there, the Canyon Lux is 1x only, and in place of a front derailleur, it has a 4.5 gram chain guide. The rear wheel uses Canyon's Quixel through axle, which makes it easy to remove the wheel without using any tools. There's internal cable routing throughout on this bike, and it uses what Canyon calls their impact protection unit, which is a bump stop that keeps the handlebars from spinning all the way around. So basically, no mid-race bar spins on this bike. Now let's talk numbers. With a 70-degree head tube angle, the Canyon Lux is the steepest bike in this category. That's partnered with a 74.5-degree effective seat tube angle, which is more in line with what the other bikes have. I'm 5'7" and I'm riding a size medium of the Lux. That comes with a 435mm reach, partnered with a 70-degree head tube angle, 435mm chainstays, and you get a 1,126mm wheelbase. The model that we're testing is available in 4 sizes, in small through extra large. Let's get into suspension details. The Canyon Lux uses a flex pivot suspension design, which means that the seat stays flex instead of using bearings. The revised kinematics are said to improve durability because you can now run less air pressure in the shock, and there's also weight savings due to fewer parts being on that linkage. The frame weighs 2,000 grams, making it the heaviest that I'm testing here. In a size medium, the complete bike that I'm testing weighs in at 22.5 pounds. That's set up with control tires, no pedals, and keep in mind that this is the only bike in this category that I'm riding that has a dropper post. Of course, there's a bar-mounted lockout, and our test bike comes with a Fox 32 step-cast fork and a Float DPS Evil rear shock. As with all of the cross-country bikes we're testing here, there's no budget version of this Canyon Lux. It's a race-oriented model, all carbon everywhere. That being said, Canyon is a direct-to-consumer brand, and we're not seeing any $10,000 models here. For testing here in Squamish, we've got the Canyon Lux CF SLX 9.0 Team Edition. It retails for $6,999, and for that price, you'll get a Shimano XTR drivetrain, Shimano XTR brakes, GT Swiss XRC 1200 carbon wheels, and a carbon fiber KS dropper post. So that's the Lux in a nutshell. Let's get into how it rides on the trails. Well, we put on those Schwalbe control tires like we did on all the different bikes.
Yep.
And then I was looking for the recommended suspension settings from the manufacturer on their website. It's a direct-to-consumer brand. I was expecting there to be, a handy little suspension calculator, and there wasn't one. So I reached out to Canyon directly and then set it at 25%, which is what they recommended.
So this bike has been around for a few seasons now, but it's also been extremely successful under Van der Poel and Pauline Ferrand, the world champion. So we know this thing goes up hills extremely fast. But first, let's talk technical climbing. Sarah, what's the story?
Well, climbing is definitely this bike's strong point. It has a steep head tube angle, has a short wheelbase, and you can just wind through trees. Like, the handling on this bike is amazing.
Now, it sounds nimble. I know we don't want to use those cliches, but I mean,
it's hard not to.
Right?
Yeah, it's definitely like a nimble feeling bike.
Yeah.
That being said, I never truly gelled with the geometry. It just doesn't feel quite as modern. Like, it feels like you're a little bit more stretched out.
It's definitely not as modern.
80mm stem, 70-degree head tube angle.
Right.
So yeah, it just didn't feel quite as comfortable as I would have liked.
It sounds like it felt very traditional cross country.
Exactly. Yeah, I couldn't put it better. Like, it came out 2 years ago. That was kind of the standard then.
Yeah.
Now things have changed a little bit. We're seeing 67.5-degree head tube angles on stuff like the Specialized Epic.
Yeah. So I also want to talk about traction as well too. There were some tricky spots on our climbs, and There was one spot that I saw you dab a few times. I won't say how many times.
Oh my gosh, so humiliating.
Yeah, it happens to the best of us. No one was
part
camping,
of that is I think that Canyon, doesn't do a lot with 100 millimeters of rear travel,
Feels quite firm.
It does. So Trek is doing a lot with 60 millimeters, what we said. And, I don't think Canyon is doing that much with 100 millimeters. It doesn't really use the entire suspension, so it feels like you don't have a ton of traction when you're climbing. And so partly that suspension on the climb, and then partly the other part of it is that you keep hitting that lockout lever by accident when you're trying to put the dropper post up.
So shout out to Canyon for putting a dropper post on this bike to begin with. That's
definitely
great. It was the only cross-country race bike of Sarah's that came with a dropper post, so that's always nice. I bet you appreciated that.
Yeah, I was looking forward to that.
Tell me about the lever, though. It uses an old school thumb lever that didn't really work with the suspension lockout.
Basically, what you're doing is when you put the seat up to climb, you can accidentally hit the lockout lever, and then you're trying to climb with your bike locked out, which is fine if you're on a fire road, but as soon as it gets technical, the bike already doesn't have that good of a traction on the climbs, and now suddenly you're locked out. So it was a bit frustrating, I would say, for sure.
So in the end, Sarah ended up rotating that thumb lever up a little bit. Ergonomically, it's not ideal.
It's difficult because then you have to kind of lift your hand up each time, and then you're not in a very powerful position. So if there's something that hits your handlebars, you're more likely to fall over. So
exactly, yeah.
When you're on a fire road climb, it feels great, It just feels really efficient. It feels poppy. It feels like it's very taking your energy that, you're putting out a lot of energy and a lot of watts on these bikes. So you really want them to be efficient. And this bike feels like it's taking all that power and helping you move up the hill. I was really glad that this was the one of my 4 cross-country bikes that had a dropper post because, the first time I pointed the bike downhill, you definitely notice that you kind of want to go over the front wheel,
Well, you don't want to.
You definitely don't want to.
But you might not have a choice.
You don't have a choice to go over the front wheel.
Yeah.
And so, I was glad that it had a dropper post, so you just want to kind of get further back.
We're going to talk about timing in a minute, but since we're talking about descending and dropper posts, how did this bike fare, given that it was the only one of your cross-country race bikes that has a dropper post? I mean, it should set the fastest time, right?
Yeah, I was definitely expecting, this bike to win the downhill on the timed laps. I thought it was, kind of cheating. I would have to do it with, both the seat up and the seat down for my time lapse, and I just ended up doing it with the seat down because it didn't win. Even with the dropper post, this bike was not the fastest on the downhill, and that's just because it's, a little bit trickier. You have to come into things a little bit slower. You're a little bit higher up. It's just not, the bike that you want to send it on the downhills for sure.
Yeah, for sure. In a way, it almost looked like the bike was kind of doing what it wanted instead of what you wanted it to do.
Yeah, it's definitely not the most predictable descender or something that you want to take on high-speed descents. You can whip it around pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But as soon as things get higher speed, it gets a little sketchy. And I had the Canyon Lux and the Trek Super Caliber on one hand, which are kind of a little bit more old school geometry, not quite as modern, harsher geometry. They feel more like a traditional cross-country bike. Like they feel like you expect a cross-country bike to feel. Like you get on them, it feels poppy, it feels fast, it feels sporty, and a little bit like they're gonna beat you up, to be honest. Like they're quite harsh. They're kind of a little bit more aggressive, I guess.
Let's move on to our timed laps, and we're going to start off on a positive note here and talk about the efficiency test. The Canyon dominated. 2 minutes, 32 seconds over our half-kilometer fire road climb. The closest bike was 6 seconds away, and that was your racy red Specialized Epic. What about the timed lap?
Time lap wasn't quite the same story. So it actually had the slowest of my 4 bikes on the entire loop. So that was quite a technical climbing trail. So it wasn't kind of that smooth gravel path or, an Albstadt course, something that's a little bit more buffed out.
It's been tricky.
And it was very wet. So it just wasn't, I think, the course that suited this bike the best. On the descent, it tied for second place with the Cannondale Scalpel, although, it's a tie, so I'm gonna say the tiebreaker is that the Cannondale Scalpel felt a whole lot more comfortable, felt a lot more in control than I did, even though this bike has that dropper post. So I'm gonna give it
I heard some interesting
slowest.
Sounds from you.
Yeah.
Okay, it's time to talk about components, and the Lux comes with, well, the parts that you would expect to see on a cross-country race bike, including a dual lockout, a 34-tooth chainring, and some carbon wheels.
Yeah, I actually had to do a double take when I saw the price of the bike, because this bike is $2,500 less expensive than any of the other bikes that I'm riding here. The Trek Super Caliber, $9,500. This bike, $7,000. So that's like a significant chunk of change.
On the other hand, that might be because it's definitely a few seasons old. It's not a brand new frame.
Yeah, so they haven't put the R&D into it recently.
That might be a factor, but tell me about some of the components on this thing, Sarah. What about that XTR drivetrain?
This was the only one of the 4 bikes that I'm riding that had Shimano XTR, and I had to say I really liked that gear ratio.
Those shifts under power?
And the shift, yeah. It was, just really pleasant, really smooth when you're, working really hard, which, often you are in a cross country.
Every now and then.
Every now and then,
right.
Our time lapse,
Yeah.
And it just worked really smoothly, everything that you could want from a drivetrain, basically. If you don't think about it, that's a good thing.
Right. It's time to talk pros and cons, and we're going to start with positive. Let's hear it.
Yeah, so this bike is a super efficient climber. It feels amazing when you're on those long gravel road climbs. It also has Shimano XTR, really liked that. And of course, we might not like the dropper post combo, but I think it's, progressive of Canyon to be putting that on a cross-country bike.
That means we're talking about cons next. What didn't you like?
Well, that suspension was just really harsh feeling. It didn't give you a lot of traction on the climbs or the descents, and then that geometry just kind of holds you back on the descents. It doesn't feel as modern as it could be.
Yeah, it feels a little dated, I imagine.
Exactly, yeah, and I look forward to the next generation of this bike. This bike is basically great for somebody who's doing a less technical cross-country race, something like a short track where it's a shorter loop, but it's not as technical. Or, a lot of places where they're riding, you don't have those World Cup courses.
You're getting over in Germany?
Yeah, climbing up the fire road and then, going down a berm trail, that would be perfect. So yeah, it's definitely the right bike for a lot of people.
Okay, and that is it for the Canyon Lux. Stay tuned for more reviews and roundtable discussions from the cross-country field test. In the meantime, should we go crush some fire road climbs?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we have this Lux here.
Yeah,
we might
it's the
as well,
best
right?
fire road climbs, yeah.